It really is good to be back with you this morning. And we had a good time on our vacation. It wasn't quite what we had planned. We had planned on meeting my oldest daughter and her family. They live in Florida and decided that this time of year is too hot in Florida, so they joined us in Colorado. And we had a great time with them. They brought us gifts. One of the boys gifted me with his cold. And so I spent the rest of vacation blowing my nose and having a sore throat and all of those things. And in fact, into this week, most of this week, I have felt that way as well. And it is due to medications that I stand before you this morning. So anyway, we continue our series of messages from Psalms. And I've entitled this morning's message, The Absence of God. Now, some of you are thinking, well, God is never absent. God is everywhere. How can God be absent? Well, God can be absent if we choose to make him absent, if we choose to exclude him from our lives. And we are going to be looking at several Psalms between Psalm 49 and Psalm 53 that all are going to address this idea of what happens when God isn't invited, when God isn't included. And we're going to see three categories of people who exclude God from their lives in various different ways. And I think in doing so, we'll see some of the dangers that we face in not recognizing God for who he is. We're going to begin our journey in Psalm 53, and in verse 1, we're going to see about those who deny God. Let's look at Psalm 53:1. The fool says in his heart, "There is no God. They are corrupt, and their ways are vile. There is no one who does good." Now, this passage begins with the statement, "The fool says in his heart." In Hebrew, there are three different terms for fool. One of them simply means someone who is just not very smart, kind of dull, doesn't have a lot of capacity there. The second word for fool is one who has convoluted logic, who comes to all the wrong conclusions in life. The third one is the one that's used here, and that is the person who intentionally makes wrong choices. The person who knows the right thing to do, but chooses to do the wrong thing. And he describes this person, says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." Now, in our culture today, there is a broad number of people in our culture, in our community, who would tell you there is no God. We may think we live in a Christian nation, but the reality is, as Christians, we are becoming more and more of a minority all of the time. There are many who do not believe in the existence of God. And you'll see in this verse here, God is very, very clear about what they're like. It says, they are corrupt and their ways are vile. There is no one who does good. That's quite an indictment of these people who say there is no God. Now, it's incredibly important, if we're going to please the God of the universe, that we first agree that he exists. Would you agree with that? In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, we find that pleasing God begins with belief in his existence. Hebrews 11:6 says, "And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." This is a kind of a model for faith. And there are two things that he says we have to agree with. Number one, that God exists. And number two, that God rewards those who seek him. In other words, that God is going to reveal himself to those who seek him. So the idea is, first of all, we have to come to the conclusion, okay, God exists, and then we've got to seek God and believe that he is going to reward our seeking him. That's kind of that journey of faith. When we begin to seek God, he's going to meet us where we are. And that's incredibly important. Going back to Psalm 53, though, we see that those who don't believe in God are living an entirely different reality. They're living a different life. In verses 2 through 4, we have God's search for those who believe in him. And it says in verse 2, God looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. Everyone has turned away, all have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Do all these evildoers know nothing? They devour my people as though eating bread. They never call on God. Now, some of you may, as I was reading verses 2 and 3 there particularly, you may have said, that sounds familiar. I think I've read that in the New Testament somewhere. Yeah, in Romans chapter 3, it talks about there's none good. And the reality is, in the New Testament, this same language is used of all mankind because to some degree, all of us at one time or another have struggled with whether there is a God or not. And so in the New Testament, we have that concept. But here, I think he's primarily applying this to those who reject God, although it does kind of indicate that he's talking to all mankind. And they are so evil, he says, that they are quite comfortable with their evil behavior. And in verse 4 there, he says, they devour my people as though eating bread. Have you ever been watching TV at night? You got a bowl of chips next to you on the table there. And you're just going to eat one or two, right? So you take one or two chips, and about 2/3 of the way through the movie, you look over and the bowl's empty. What happened? You weren't even conscious that you were eating all of that. I think that's what he's talking about here. They devour my people almost without thinking about it. Like it doesn't even matter. They are evildoers. Now, the consequence of this unbelief is also significant as well. In verse 5, the psalmist tells us about the consequence of it, of this unbelief. He says, but there they are, overwhelmed with dread where there was nothing to dread. Now, I want to stop right there. I think this is a significant statement here. They are overcome with dread where there is nothing to dread. We live in a society that is afraid, that is dreading things. And many of the things people fear will never happen, probably could never happen. These things are not things that we need to dread. They are not things that we need to fear. And yet those who do not know God, who have divorced God from their life, they say, there is no God. They are now left exposed in a world without the protection of God, and that's a fearful thing. And a lot of things become fearful when you're that exposed. They are overwhelmed with dread where there's nothing to dread. Goes on and says, God scattered the bones of those who attacked you. You put them to shame, for God despised them. So God has opposed them, and God has put them to shame. And that is the life of those who live without God, those who would say there is no God. Now, for most of us, we would come to the end of this psalm, and we'd pat ourselves on the back. I'm not in that group because I believe there is a God. And I'm not denying God. Okay, great. Let's look at another one of the Psalms that we're going to be looking at this morning. This one's Psalm 50. And this one I've entitled, Those Who Have Forgotten God. Those Who've Forgotten God. In verse 22 of this psalm, the psalmist says this, "Consider this, you who forget God, or I will tear you to pieces with no one to rescue you." Once again, he's very, very strong in judgment against these people. But this time it's not that they have denied God's existence. This is different. He says, you who forget God. Now I want you to think about that for a moment because it's a very different group of people than the first group we looked at. First group we looked at, those are atheists. They say there is no God. We don't have to worry about God. He doesn't exist. This group forgot God. Now, in order to forget God, doesn't that imply at one time that you certainly believed in God? Maybe even to the point of having faith in God? And he's saying here now there's this group that forgets God or forgot God. Let's look at the psalm a little bit closer, and I'm going to pick it up in verse 5. And in verses 5 through 7, we see that these people are God's people. He says, "Gather to me this consecrated people who made a covenant with me by sacrifice, and the heavens proclaim his righteousness, for he is a God of justice. Listen, my people, and I will speak." And then at the end of this verse, "I will testify against you, Israel. I am God, your God." I will testify against you. Why? Because they have forgotten him. He says here in these verses, they are his people. He says they are consecrated people. He's made a covenant with them by my sacrifice. God has done everything to build a relationship with these people. And they are his people. But he has a complaint among his people. In verses 8 through 13, we read about how these people are engaged in worship, but God is not satisfied with it. In verse 8, we begin, "I bring no charges against you concerning your sacrifices or concerning your burnt offerings, which are ever before me. I have no need of a bull from your stall or of goats from your pens, for every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills." What God is saying here is, you keep bringing these sacrifices to me. Do you think I need these sacrifices? They're going through the motions of worship, but there's something definitely missing from their worship. And he's saying, I could get all the animals that I want because, hey, everything on earth is mine. I don't need you to bring me these sacrifices. You see, what God is interested in is their hearts. And their hearts are missing something. He goes on and says, "I know every bird in the mountains and the insects in the fields are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all that is in it. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats?" He's referring here again to the sacrifices. Do I really need the sacrifices that you're bringing? This worship is not for God's benefit. Worship is going to make a difference for us as well. And so in verses 16 through 22, we see that the actions of these people, and this is where we meet the problem, the actions of these people betray their true beliefs. Verse 16 says, "But to the wicked person, God says, what right have you to recite my laws or take my covenant on your lips?" Whoa, that's all of a sudden. "You hate my instruction and cast my words behind you. When you see a thief, you join with him. You throw in your lot with adulterers. You use your mouth for evil and harness your tongue to deceit. You sit and testify against your brother and slander your own mother's son. When you did these things and I kept silent, you thought I was exactly like you. What he's saying here is because you didn't get immediately punished for these evil things you did, you thought God was okay with this. What a mistake to think that, oh, God must be okay. He hasn't struck me down yet. And by the way, I've heard that very statement made by people. God's okay with it because he hasn't struck me down yet. That's not something to be bragging about. He says, but I now arraign you, this is a legal term, arraignment, and set my accusations before you. Consider this, you who forget God, or I will tear you to pieces with no one to rescue you. Wow. I will tear you to pieces. What God is saying here is that in the midst of all of these sacrifices they're bringing, all of the pious behavior, all of the appearance of religiosity, these people are living evil lives. They know who God is. They are God's chosen people. They worship him on a regular basis. But over here on the side, they're doing all the evil things that the evildoers are doing. And they think they're getting away with it. God says no. God then promises salvation to those who are genuine in their faith. Psalm 50, verses 14 and 15. Sacrifice thank offerings to God. Fulfill your vows to the Most High, and call on me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you will honor me. I want to just point out a couple things here. First, sacrifice thank offerings to God. Thankfulness to God is, I think, one of the most important attitudes that we can embrace. Because when we properly acknowledge our dependence upon God, we are putting ourselves in the proper perspective to God. We are acknowledging that he is the Almighty and we are his people. And so we need to be thankful. We need to fulfill our vows to the Most High. In other words, follow through on what you know to be right. If you know something to be right, follow through and do it. Don't rationalize all kinds of disobedience because I can get away with it. Then he says, call on me in the day of trouble. There will come times of trouble. They come to all of us. There are those days when we're really down, when we're really hurting, when we're encountering things that we didn't expect to encounter. He says, I'll deliver you, and you will honor me. Notice the two-way path here. I will deliver you, and you will honor me. That's the key here. We want for this to be a time when we draw together on his power and then give him all the praise for what he has done. So the second group we have here is those who have forgotten God. They are actually God's people. They're very pious people. Others looking at them from the outside would say, they're very religious people. And yet, that's not where their heart is. That's not where their actions are. Third group of people is in Psalm 52. In Psalm 52, and also we're going to spend most of our time in Psalm 49, we encounter those who have replaced God with material things. Those who've replaced God with material things. Psalm 52:7 says, Here now is the man who did not make God his stronghold, but trusted in his great wealth and grew strong by destroying others. There are many in our world today who are convinced that material things and power is what life is all about. We need to accumulate things. We need to seek power over the lives of others. And when we do that, we're truly going to be happy in life. That's where fulfillment is. Well, in Psalm 49, and we're going to spend a little bit of time here in Psalm 49, we begin this journey of looking at what does this mean. In verses 1 through 4, God gives us a call to listen. And this is just kind of a wake-up call, if you will. He says, "Hear this, all you peoples. Listen, all who live in this world, both low and high, rich and poor alike." So he's talking to both those who have a lot and those who don't have a lot. And by the way, a lot of times people will tell me, well, I couldn't possibly be depending upon my wealth because I'm not a wealthy person. The reality is you don't have to be wealthy to be depending on material things. In fact, it's easy to be very poor and cling to those material things you have as your hope. We need to recognize that this is a problem of both rich and poor alike. It's not just the rich. He goes on and says, "My mouth will speak words of wisdom. The meditation of my heart will give you understanding. I will turn my ear to a proverb. With the harp I will expound my riddle." Kind of sounds like Proverbs during this chapter here as well. He then, in verses 5 and 6, questions our source of trust. Where is your trust? "Why should I fear when evil days come, when wicked deceivers surround me? Those who trust in their wealth and boast of their great riches." He's saying here, if I'm rich, why do I have to worry about the evil days? I've got my wealth. I've got my riches. Now, we all know there are many, many stories about people who had very large amounts of money and who lost it all. Or maybe they had large amounts of money and they were very unhappy, even in the midst of their wealth. But what the psalmist has called us to here is, where is your trust? Is your trust in God, or is your trust in your things, the things that you own? Verses 7 through 13, he tells us about the problem with wealth. There is a problem with depending on it. He says in verse 7, "No one can redeem the life of another or give to God a ransom for them." I'm sure there are times that people have bargained with God and said, "God, I'll give you all this money if you'll just save this person." Can you do that? No. There's no amount of money that you can do. The ransom for a life is costly. No payment is ever enough, so that they should live on forever and not see decay. You can't buy eternal life. "For all can see that the wise die, that the foolish and the senseless also perish, leaving their wealth to others." So on the one hand, you've got the wise. On this side, you got the foolish. What's going to happen? They're both going to die. What happens when they die? Somebody else inherits their wealth. Kind of sounds kind of empty. What's the difference? Why should we care? "Their tombs will remain their houses forever, their dwellings for endless generations, though they had named lands after themselves. People, despite their wealth, do not endure. They are like the beasts that perish. This is the fate of those who trust in themselves and of their followers who approve their sayings." He's telling us here, if you trust in yourself, This is your fate. Your fate is vanity. Your fate is meaninglessness. Life will pass you on. He then, in verses 16 through 20, concludes this chapter with a lesson about wealth. He says, "Do not be overawed when others grow rich, when the splendor of their houses increases." I frequently hear from people who they've maybe made a new friend who really has a lot of things. And they're immediately enamored with the wealth of their new friend. And they are awed by it. You ever experience that? I mean, there have been times I've met some very, very wealthy people in my life, and there's that temptation when you first meet them to go, wow, this is so cool. But he says, don't be overawed when others grow rich. For they will take nothing with them when they die. Their splendor will not descend with them. Though while they live, they count themselves blessed, and people praise you when you prosper. They will join those who have gone before them, who will never again see the light of life. People who have wealth but lack understanding are like the beasts that perish. What he's saying here is it is completely pointless to depend upon our wealth or our power. Instead, we need to depend upon our relationship with God himself. We should not deny the existence of God. We should not forget who God is. We should not replace God by worshiping our things instead. Those are the three groups of people we've met this morning. God says, I am the Almighty God. It is only in God that we see complete fulfillment in life. The reality is, it is only what we do for him that counts for eternity. What we have done for him will never be in vain. Let's commit to living our lives for the God of the universe, committed to him, believing not only that he exists, but he is interested in a personal relationship with us, and nothing else matters when compared to him. Let's bow for a word of prayer before we partake of communion here. God, we thank you this morning for this lesson from the Psalms about our relationship with you. And I pray, God, that you would help us to just recognize the importance of staying close to the Lord our God, to being obedient, to living consistent lives, where we not only worship you, but we worship you in our actions and the way we live our lives and the way we manage our possessions. God, I pray that every aspect of our life would be brought under your control. This we ask in your name. Amen.